Okay, so this is our second video on adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers. This video is going to focus solely on the subtracting part. So again, you're going to be using the same note sheet that you've been taking notes on. We've already done the left side of our note sheet here, all that addition with both fractions and mixed numbers. So now we are going to focus on the right side, the subtraction part. So we're going to go ahead and start at the top right-hand corner. So we've got our example 2/3 minus 3/8, but we first want to fill in our note sheet. So again, just like when we were adding fractions and mixed numbers, we must have a common denominator. That is a necessity. So a common denominator. Now again, once we find that common denominator, it's very similar to addition. We want to change the numerator and denominator by multiplying by the same number. Now here, this is where it changes just slightly. Here we want to subtract the numerators since we're doing a subtraction problem. So we subtract the numerators and we still keep the denominator. So the denominator stays the same once we found the common denominator, but we are subtracting the numerators. And then our last step, if possible, we want to simplify. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our example problem. We've got 2/3 minus 3/8. So our first thing that we need to have is that common denominator. So when I look at 3 and 8, I think to change these into a denominator of 24. So I had to multiply my 3 by 8 to get to 24. So I have to do the same thing to my numerator. Make sure you're writing down all of these notes in your note sheet. So 8 times 2 gives us 16. When I look at my second fraction, I had to multiply 8 by 3 to get to 24. So I do the same thing to my numerator, and I should have 9 24ths. So now that I've gotten my common denominator of 24, and I've also changed my numerators, we now want to subtract our numerators. So 16 minus 9. So when we take 16 and subtract 9 from there, we end up with 7. We keep our denominator the same, so it's 24. And then we need to see, can we simplify this fraction? So in this case, we cannot simplify, and 7/24 is our final answer. So we're going to go ahead and do an additional subtraction problem. So go ahead and add that problem that we're going to be doing to the same page in your notebook that you were doing your extra addition with fractions and mixed numbers. So our problem here says subtract the following fraction, 5/9 minus 1/2. So again, make sure you're doing this example in your notebook since it can't fit on your note sheet. So here we want to first get that common denominator. So I see a 9 and 2, and I'm going to change these into denominators of 18. So then when I look at my first fraction, 5/9, I had to multiply 9 by 2 to get to 18. So I do the same thing to my numerator. 2 multiplied by 5 gives me 10. And I look at my second fraction, I had to multiply 2 by 9. So I have to do the same thing again to my numerator. 1 multiplied by 9 gives me 9. So since we have our common denominators and we changed our numerators, now we are going to subtract our numerators. So 10 minus 9 gives me 1. And I keep my denominator the same. So again, our last step is to see if we can simplify. Here we can't. So our final answer is 1/18. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the second, or I guess the last section in your note sheet, and that's subtracting with mixed numbers. So it's the bottom right-hand side of your note sheet. So here's our example, and now we're going to again start with just filling out our note sheet first. So just like when we were adding mixed numbers, we must have that common denominator for the fractional part of your number. So those two fractions need to have a common denominator. So here, the first thing we want to do after we get that common denominator is subtract the fractions. Once you subtract your fractions, you can subtract your whole numbers. Now, there are some special cases where you may have to borrow. And for fractions, that's going to look like taking one whole away from the first whole number and changing that into a fraction. So here it says the new numerator is found by adding the numerator and denominator. And this example is going to show us exactly what that means. And then, of course, our last step is to simplify if that is possible. So I'm going to go ahead and find my common denominator here first. And when I'm looking at both 9 and 6, I'm going to change our common denominator, or our denominator, to 18. So I'm going to rewrite this whole expression. So to get from 9 to 18, I needed to multiply by 2. So I do the same thing to my numerator, and I have 8 over 18 minus 1. And I'm going to change my denominator here to 18 as well. I had to multiply 6 by 3, so I do the same thing to my numerator, and I should have 15 eighteenths. So here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Our first step, once we have that common denominator, says to subtract our fractions. Now here, 8 minus 15, we can't do. If we only have 8 of something, we can't take 15 away from it. So what we need to do is we need to focus on this fraction right here, okay? We're actually going to borrow from the whole number. So I'm going to take 3 and I'm going to turn it into a 2. And that one whole that I'm taking away, I'm going to add to this fraction here. So when I take one whole away, one whole can be expressed as 18 over 18. That's 1 when you simplify it. Since our fraction has a denominator of 18, I'm going to change this to be 18 over 18. So to borrow it, I need to combine this 18 eighteenths with my 8 eighteenths. So that's what it means by adding the numerator and denominator. So I'm going to do 18 plus 8 and get 26 and keep the denominator the same. So 2 and 26 eighteenths is the same as 3 and 8 eighteenths. I just borrowed one whole and added 18 eighteenths to my fraction. Then I just bring down what I already had, 1 and 15 eighteenths. Now I can do 26 minus 15. Since I can do that, 26 minus 15 gives us 11. Keep the denominator the same, 11 eighteenths. And then 2 minus 1, we got to subtract our whole numbers, we get 1. So our final answer should be 1 and 11 eighteenths. So when we borrow, it is a little bit trickier. So on this one, we're actually going to do 2 additional example problems, one with borrowing and one without. So again, we're going to record these in our notebook on the next page. So we're going to start here with 7 3/4 minus 3 2/3. So our first step, we need to get a common denominator. So between 4 and 12, our common denominator should be, or 4 and 3, excuse me, our common denominator should be 12. So we have 7, and we're going to change this to 12. We had to multiply 4 by 3. So we do the same thing to our numerator. So 7 and 9/12. Then we are going to subtract 3, and we need to change this denominator to a 12 as well. So we multiply 3 by 4. We do the same thing to our numerator. So 2 multiplied by 4 gives us 8. So we've got a common denominator. Now we want to see if we can subtract our numerators. 9 minus 8. Here we can do 9 minus 8, which gives us 1. 12 is our denominator, stays the same. Now we can subtract our whole numbers, 7 and 3. So 7 minus 3 gives us 4. 4 and 1/12 should be our answer. So that one didn't require any borrowing. Our next one here, our next example, is going to have some borrowing in it. So you'll be able to see that process again. So here, subtracting with borrowing, we still need to make sure we get our common denominator. So here with 4 and 8 as our denominator, actually we only have to change one fraction, which is awesome. and we're going to use a common denominator of 8. So here, 3 stays the same. That whole number stays the same. So we had to multiply 4 by 2 to get to 8. We do the same thing in our numerator. So 3 6/8. Then we're going to subtract. Our whole number 1 stays the same, and our second fraction doesn't need to be changed because it has the denominator of 8 already. Now here, 6 minus 7. If we have 6 of something, we can't take 7 away from it. So we have to do some borrowing. I'm going to change this 3 into a 2 and take that 1 whole and add it to this fraction. So here, since our denominator is 8, we're going to add 8 over 8 to this problem. Okay, so we have a whole number of 2. Then when we add 8/8 or 1 whole to our fraction, we get 14 over 8. The 6 plus 8 gives us 14, and we leave our 8 in the denominator the same. So we took 1 whole from that 3, turned it into a 2, and took that 1 whole and added it to our fraction. And then we bring down our other fraction here, or our other mixed number, minus 1 7/8. Now when we look at our fraction, 14 minus 7, we can do that. So 14 minus 7, that's going to give us 7 in our numerator, 8 stays the same. And then we can look at our whole numbers. 2 minus 1 gives us 1. So our final answer on this one should be 1 7/8. So borrowing can be a little bit tricky. Just make sure you're adding that whole that you borrow to the fraction that's connected to it. Okay, so that concludes our video on subtracting fractions and mixed numbers. Since you have finished your note sheet, you're actually going to glue this into your notebook, and then you'll have that for future reference when you guys are studying or reviewing fractions.